I have a third book. It's titled Bicycle Dreaming, and I have this experience of reading books as an adult that were perhaps written for adults, because at least once upon a time we didn't have this genre of young adult books. It's more of a marketing term than actually, I think, a literary term. And I read these books when I was a kid, and now I have this experience as an adult of reading them again. And of course, it's this great opportunity to revisit the person I used to be, to note changes, to again inhabit that person minus the changes, minus aging or wisdom or whatever. But that aside, I mean, revisiting the books, it's this great pleasure of discovering that in many ways I'm the same person now as I ever was. I'm only as smart now as I was then, or maybe I'm a little impressed that I was smart enough then. And these are books that sometimes I was told not to read, and at other times they were recommended books. Or I remember reading Goldsmith's Vanity Fair maybe when I was 12, and the uncle from whom I borrowed it to read did not believe that I'd read it. But anyway, in revisiting books like this, I am especially amazed at the books that resonate with the adult me, that continue to inform me, that continue to engage me, not just at the level of story, but at the level of ideas. And books like A Separate Peace, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and I wanted to write a book like that. I felt like it's a book I would want, if someone is already an adult, to be able to read, but if they were young, to perhaps read it now. And then it's very ambitious, I think, for me to think like this, but to imagine that this reader will come back in 20 years and read it again. And that's how the idea for Bicycle Dreaming came about. It also came because I read to children, have for a few years now, had a small library in our neighborhood where some neighborhood children who are not children who are exposed to books at all, and at least the most recent batch we have, they're about anywhere from age 4 to age 14. Many of them don't have any level of literacy. They have informal schooling, not formal schooling. When we first started the program, it was in an NGO, and the kids who attended this particular NGO school had, even though they came from very disenfranchised backgrounds, their parents were the big enfranchising force in their lives. These parents had gone out and found this school, and they were very, very ambitious for their children, and the children reflected this. And they would come to our reading sessions with sort of this ambitious outlook. Now we have children, because the NGO has changed, now we have children who are, on the whole, a different package. They are coming into the room, in some cases just to kill time. But in any case, we read to these children once a week, and we let them check out books once a week and bring the books back. And even when we had the really ambitious kids in the room, even then the reading levels were all over the place. We had little girls who read sparkly unicorn books, and little boys who read the big truck books. I'm talking about 10-year-olds who were reading board books that are meant for 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds. And we had kids who read Tagore, and who read Harry Potter, and who read C.S. Lewis in Hindi, and who read the Tintin comic books in Hindi. And so I'm always struck by how far books reach. In terms of technology, books and reading have a reach that is almost like nothing else. I think they're very central to the human experience. You can go to a 12-year-old who comes to school for only an hour and a half a day, because she has to wait for the hour and a half where her family is not at work. Her mother might get up at 6 in the morning and go do domestic work in a bunch of places, come home by 12, so that the kid has an hour and a half where she's not taking care of a younger child. And so she can come into this, and then she comes to our reading program for an hour, and the books reach her, and I find it very, very moving. But I was very stymied in reading to these children, even though there were, and increasingly are, many great picture books available for them. there's not a lot of, there isn't a wealth of literature in India that records their lives, elevates their experiences on the platform of literature, and also talks back to them about their experiences so that they can critique and say, that's not me, you didn't get it right, or actually, I finally see myself. All of these great experiences we take for granted as readers who have had access to books, or that I take for granted as a reader who has had access to books all my lives, reading, some uncle's copy of Vanity Fair and things like that. These kids don't have, and so part of my thinking was also when I wrote this book was I wanted to write a book that would speak about them. As to the ambition to speak to them, a writer only has so much say. The kids don't have the level of literacy, none of them, even the ones who are maybe reading Tintin comic books would struggle with this particular book. It's literary fiction that young kids should be able to read, and it's literary fiction that adults should be able to read, and it's literary fiction that a kid who reads now might want to read again when they are an adult. It's the story of a little girl and 1 year in her life, from when she's 13 to when she's 14, and she is typical of the kind of child who comes to our reading program. No, in the end I wasn't, I don't know if I ever considered writing. Yes, I did. Once upon a time the book was actually conceived of as a picture book. In its earliest iteration I saw it as a picture book, a story about a girl who wants to ride a bicycle, hence the title Bicycle Dreaming, and the various forces that conspire to keep her from doing it. Ultimately, of course, her discovery is that the thing that's finally stopping her is herself, and so on. So thematically, it's been done, but the social milieu of the story was going to be very uniquely. It's set in Chirag Delhi, New Delhi, which is the neighborhood next to my middle class neighborhood. It's a working poor neighborhood, working class neighborhood, and I was not able to have it be a picture book, and I was not able to. I chose not to. I was not able to in the sense that I'm not the writer to do that picture book. I found that I'm the writer who will write a novel-length work of literary fiction, and the language will be somewhat inaccessible for a kid who has not had schooling. It would be just, I think, too much of a struggle for the kids in my. I had the experience of excerpting a chapter. It's a chapter called Boys versus Girls, or actually it's Girls versus Boys, and it's about a little boy, a class 8 kid reaching into a school bag of a classmate, a girl, and pulling out a sanitary napkin, a pad, and not knowing what it was and waving it around in the air, and then all the kids sort of dive bombing him, and then a couple of girls burst into tears, and then the girls decide to boycott the boys in the class. They don't speak to them for a couple of weeks. And that's a chapter I could actually, in translation, present it to those kids and they would get it. But there are many other chapters that are about the parents of this girl and their experience. The child's family, the income in the family comes from waste work. The father's a kabadiwala, and he loses this relatively high status job in the course of the book and becomes someone who's manually scavenging in the heap. And the mother leaves, and there's already tension in the family. From the daughter's perspective, much of the book is from the daughter's perspective, although it's not a first-person book, because the child has always felt that the mother favored the son. But then we have a whole chapter that looks at it from the mother's perspective. Why would a woman favor her boy over her girl? When the mother leaves, she goes to live with the son, who is older and has just recently started working and has an income, and he has tension with the father because he's bringing in the income and the father expects to control the income. Meanwhile, the father loses his income. So a lot going on in this family, and I think it is not that that's an experience the kids in my reading club wouldn't have encountered in their own lives. It comes from what I've observed of their lives. And it's the kind of tensions and drama we have in all classes of society, because roughly human experience, the way we love or the way we fight with each other is similar, I think. But it's that you have to have read a lot to be able to have reading be the way in which you delve into complexity. And these kids just have not read enough to go into the complex inner psyche of this mother and how she came as a very young girl into a marriage where she had very few choices. The one thing she chose was her son. The daughter came later. She didn't choose that. So she has always, you could say favored, but she's always viewed her son as hers in a way that she couldn't, her daughter. And it's not because of the boy child, the story we tell of why the boy child is the favored has sort of economic, components to that story, and social and historical and traditional parampara reasons why boys are favored. For this woman, it's actually very purely psychological, and that's the great strength of fiction, I think, is we have access to beyond how a person is dictated to by society in their thoughts. Where in there is the person's own thought. And so when I go into this woman's thinking, in one chapter in this book, I expect to lose people who haven't read a lot and who don't have familiarity with reading as the way to access people's inner lives. I see a trend in literature right now where people are writing a lot of aspirational literature. It's literature in which either characters have acquired things or are trying to acquire things, or we see the writer's own aspirations for sort of being consumed or consuming. And I don't think my works are at all interested in that, because I'm very conscious of that, so I consciously sidestep that, I hope. My characters are not, for the most part, existing relative to their aspirations to be elsewhere. They're actually, it's not a question of whether they're content in their lives or not. No, they struggle in their lives, and they struggle with their ideas, and they have tensions around their class positions. But there is a wholeness to their lives. I don't depict their lives as being missing something that can only be completed by, for example, climbing the hierarchy. So the powerlessness they experience might result in anger or frustration, but not necessarily in a sense that this is not the life I'm supposed to live. I'm supposed to live some other life. That one experiences injustice without then translating it into this is a mistake. I was never supposed to be here. I'm smarter than that. If I were to critique books like that, I can cite, for example, Arvind Adiga's White Tiger. There's a singular and exceptional human being who's just accidentally born into the wrong class and therefore sort of separates from it. I'm not interested in that project. My characters, actually, none of them are exceptional in the sense that they need out from their lives for any reason that has to do with their exceptional. The novel as a project sponsors the exceptional human being, and I actually consciously push against that project. Okay, so are my characters experiencing lives as characters in some other social milieu would experience it? A father loses his job, daughter watches parents come apart, estranged, under pressure from this, to some extent, yes, but I don't know that when I start writing. It's a curiosity. I'm trying to figure out if the interiority of people's lives, their headspaces, is the same across cultures or caste or class or... and I don't really know till I write. And if I can't get the book to cohere, if I can't get it to hang together for me, right then the idea that it might be the same fails. And of course there are fissures, and I find the places where it fails as I go along. So this father in my book who loses his job, and how the fact that he's a kudawala and not an executive in an MNC then plays out in some ways very similarly in the child's headspace, because he has protected her perhaps in the same way that an MNC executive would protect his daughter. He, for example, does not tell her he's going to lose the job for a long time before he loses it. He keeps struggling. She does not see him the way the world sees him, because he has protected her from that view of him as, in some places in his life, as powerless. So it is a chance encounter where she goes to the market to collect him one late night, and she sees the men he interacts with in the market, the way in which they are talking to him, the way one of them shoves him away because he's asking for a chance to hold on to the job on the terms that he's held on to in the past. Those terms are changing now. It's only when she sees that there's this big rupture in her sense of everything, in her sense of her father as a protective figure. And that rupture is similar for her to the kind of rupture a kid in some other class would experience. So in that sense, I found my plot allowed me to see people as experiencing similar things, even though the actual plot itself moves in a completely different space when it's moving through a Kudawala's neighborhood, a Kabadiwala's job, cycling through rich people's neighborhoods, in a one-room home versus, a nice bungalow somewhere else in Delhi. But if I had not, I'm not transcribing a book I've already written in my head onto a page. I'm figuring it out as I go. So if I had not been able to get it to hang together, I would have failed there. And the next question, of course, is whether the readers will be convinced. So the book has to go out there. I had this experience with my very first book, which was a collection of short fiction that moved through upper middle class homes and working class homes again and again throughout stories. Most of the time by looking at the shared spaces people have, which is the kitchen of a middle class home where the woman of that home and another woman who comes in to help end up sharing that space. And I took these stories at one time to a university in Delhi to talk to faculty there that had gathered for this symposium. So there were faculty from many surrounding outside of Delhi colleges who had come in, and I did a reading, and then I did a discussion and took questions from the audience. And again, people in the audience said to me, "This is not true. This is not how these people think. You've just put your thoughts in their head." And I was very thrilled by this encounter because I felt like I was really going head to head with people. And that's why I write. I want to go head to head with people. I don't think that literature by itself convinces people, no matter how well it is written. I wouldn't even necessarily argue that I'm writing amazing literature. I think I'm writing well, and I'm contending with things that I'm very curious about and very interested in, and I definitely stake myself in my literature. I hope that one of the things that literature does, I hope that I have an opportunity to do that with my writing, that my writing is good enough to push conversations to happen. Because that's the other thing books do. We don't just read them in isolation. I write it in isolation, it goes out there, it's read in isolation, but then it's talked about. And that isolation breaks at that point. It could be that the 15-year-old reading it again at 45 will be talking to herself again, but it could be the 15-year-old will talk to another 15-year-old, or it could be the 15-year-old will look at her mother in a new way and start talking, not about the book, but to her mother in a different way. So, and it could be that some faculty will be convinced somewhere. That's my hope, that there's these widening conversations literature creates. In this story, I am convinced about everything, but I have stories that I'm not convinced and then I have to abandon them. I've struggled for a long time to write a story about a hangman. He's not really a hangman, he's the judge, but in my story, his identity as a judge, which has always been of someone who's removed from the sentence he passes. And so I'm looking at capital punishment in fiction, and so I can do in fiction what doesn't actually happen to the judge in real life. I can collapse things, and then he sort of, because of fictional reasons, becomes a hangman. And then I wanted certain things to happen in the story, and it's not happening. He's not having the thoughts I thought he would have. He's having other thoughts, and then in the middle of this struggle, I took it to my writers group, which is a group of other writers who also write, and they said it doesn't work. So it's not that one has ideas about how the world works and then one just gets to record them. I think writing is really a way of figuring things out. for most people who write. So in this case, I wouldn't even say that I found out that what I had thought was true was not true. It's that I hadn't even thought of much of anything to begin with, and that what I hoped was true maybe is not true, but there's always the question of skill also. So as a writer, I have to go back to failed stories and think to myself, the idea that I'm trying to figure out here is not necessarily unsound just because I don't have the skill to lay it out to myself. So I'm thinking about revisiting the story and trying again. But there's also a point of diminishing returns and so on. I'm not only a writer, I'm many, many, many other things. And I was many things before I became a writer. I'm at this festival that I'm here for. I speak about feminism, and I had thought a lot over the last few days preparing for the talk about how actually I was a writer. I mean, I was a feminist long before I was a writer. And for me, being a feminist isn't an identity so much as it's an orientation to the world. I mean, being an Indian is an identity, it's a national identity. I have a piece of paper to show it and so on. It's a cultural identity, it's a historic identity. But being a feminist for me is more about an orientation and a way of seeing the world. So I'm very convinced of certain ideas, like that there is inequality in this world is an idea that I don't need to explore in a story to find out if indeed there is inequality. I know there's inequality. How does it play out? What does it do to people's heads? How do I know there is inequality? How do I even know it's there? Why am I not convinced by the people who tell me that this is an equal world and look, women have achieved so much? Or somebody was just now in the auditorium elsewhere in the festival speaking about a kitty party of women publishers and how they exclude men, and I thought to myself, good Lord, I hadn't heard the news that women run the world of publishing or anywhere. So I don't listen to that and then become convinced that I was wrong and that publishing is dominated by a cackle of hens or something. I know what I know. I explore what I know to know more about it. I am informed not only by the stories I write, I'm informed by my life experiences. And my feminism comes from a place where, first of all, I experience inequality and I know it in myself. Then I have a sense that, wait a minute, it's happening to other people too. And then I understand why it's happening. And many of my stories are about figuring out the extent to which women in their own headspaces aren't women. They are people who experience inequality and then retain autonomy, which is why patriarchy has to operate as hard as it does, because somehow in our headspaces we are autonomous, which is how we continue to know inequality as inequality. We're not convinced that inequality is equality. This is not 1984, and Orwell has not, that was not a prescriptive novel. As it turns out, human beings continue to know for themselves.